Task with Inlaid event. Okay, here we have an example of different tasks that we can use with inlaid events. These tasks do have two outlets. Okay, so it's very important to take into account that a simple task or a simple human task or a simple system task is only going to have one outlet. But in this case, they can have one or more inlets and one or two outlets. Okay, this is optional. They could have only one or they could have two. And then it says the normal task outlet, it's not always required. The one that's always mandatory, the one that we always have to draw in the diagram, is the outlet that comes out of the inlaid event. So here we have three different options. We have task with inlaid message event, task with inlaid time event, and then a task with a inlaid multiple event. Instead of explaining this all here, I'm going to explain it in the next slides. Okay, remember all of these objects we're seeing, they all have a code. This code is internal, but sometimes it's even easier for us after some time with experience to just say a TPM instead of saying a task with inlaid message event. Okay, so this is initially it's a bit difficult to remember. We might want to know the names, but later on with a bit more of experience, once we've been working with different diagrams, it's going to be quite easy to use or to refer to the objects using these codes. Okay, so how do we create a task with an inlaid event? The first thing we have to do is drop a task into the canvas of our diagram. And then we go to look for an event and we decide which event we want to inlay inside. So we can grab a intermediate message event or an intermediate time event. Okay, and as soon as we drop it inside of the other object, it's going to automatically turn these two normal personal tasks into a task with a time event, with an inlaid time event or an inlaid message event. Okay, so we can see this is quite easy. All we have to do is add the personal task and then drag the intermediate event into that personal task. Now we're going to see an example of how to use a task with inlaid time event. Okay, or what we could call a TPT. Okay, this would be the code. So let's say Sarah receives a task, and once Sarah has finished performing her task, the flow arrives to Anna. So Anna has a task that she's supposed to perform. Okay, but she might perform it or she might not, or maybe it takes her some time to perform this task. So let's say she receives it today in her inbox, and she has to start working with it, but a certain moment in time arrives. So if this happens, if this moment in time arrives, and this has been defined inside of the inlaid activity that's been embedded in her task, then the flow is going to go through this outlet here. Okay, so it's going to activate a task for wheel. So as we could see, Anna received the task. She wasn't able to perform it on time, so the flow went out through this thread over here. But let's say Anna was able to perform it on time. If she was able to perform it on time, the thread that would have been activated would have been this one here. And then John would have received a task. Okay, so let's say if Anna does perform the task, the flow is going to go out through this outlet here. If Anna doesn't perform the task on time, then the flow is going to go out this other way. And before we mentioned that there can be one or two outlets in this TPT object, but we said that one of them is mandatory, the one that goes out of this time event. This one is not actually mandatory. So what would happen? If Anna receives a task and it only has one inlet that comes out of this embedded inlaid event, what's going to happen is that, let's say Anna doesn't have time, so the moment in time arrives, then the flow would go out this way. Or let's say Anna finished it on time, so she finished it before this moment arrived, and if so, the flow is still going to go out through this outlet. Okay, so if we would have only drawn one unique outlet, then the flow is always going to go through that outlet, regardless if it went out because of the time or if it went out because Anna actually performed her task. Okay, this is a bit difficult to know in which case we have to use this type of object initially because we don't have very much experience. But later on, when we start diagramming and we start working with different scenarios, this is going to be quite easy. Now we're going to see another example. This time it's a task with an inlaid message event. So we can see Sarah performs her task, Anna receives her task, and here we have an inlaid message event. What's going to happen if someone inputs information into this inlaid message? The flow is going to go to Wheel. And if Anna finishes her task before that, then it would go to John. Okay, so it's the exact same scenario. The only thing that changes is that instead of a moment in time that has to be reached, it has to be that someone inputs information into this form. Okay, so let's say Anna is performing an activity. She has to do a task. Maybe she has to recover a debt from someone who owes money to the, I don't know, maybe they owe tax money. Okay, so Anne as a public servant, she has to recover this debt, but maybe there's an inspector in her office who could actually cancel the task. Why? Because maybe uh, whoever owed this amount of money, these taxes, maybe they've already paid. Okay, so immediately the inspector of this office could automatically, well, not automatically, but they could input the information in this inlaid message event and cancel Anna's task. So in this case, Anna wouldn't be able to finish her task because this inspector already did it for her. Then the flow would go out this way. Okay, if Anna would have finished her task before the inspector input the information into this inlaid event, then the flow would have gone out this way. And when the inspector tries to interact with this task, they wouldn't even find it because the task has already been performed. Okay, so the inspector could only interact with the task as long as Anna has it in her workflow. Here we have an example of a task with an inlaid message event. Okay, just what I just mentioned, but with a graphical representation. So let's suppose that in a repossession process, a task, this TPM, arrives to a repossession manager. They must ensure that all the necessary procedures are carried out so that the process can continue. But during the repossession phase, the owner of the property can make the debt payment and thus stop the repossession. In order to do so, the property owner must deliver the proof of payment to the chief inspector of repossessions. That's this person here we can see in this representation. Now, once the payment data is entered into the system, the repossession is cancelled. Okay, so this chief inspector could actually decide to which of these processes they want to interact with. As long as the process has its flow stopped in any of these tasks, this chief inspector is going to be able to interact with these tasks. Okay, so why isn't a task sent to the chief inspector of the repossessions? Well, let's say payments of the repossessions phase are quite unusual. Therefore, it wouldn't make sense to be sending a whole bunch of tasks to the chief inspector when most of the time their intervention is not necessary. Okay, so here there's just a representation or an example of 4 different processes of 4 different repossessions that have to be performed. But let's say there's hundreds a month and there's lots of people in charge of these repossessions. Why would we want the chief inspector to have hundreds of tasks in their workflow when they can't even interact with them? Okay, it's much better to just give them access. We grant access to the process, so whenever they want, they can input information into that process and unblock the situation. Okay. Now here we're going to see a difference between an intermediate time event and a personal task with a time event. We already saw the intermediate time events. Okay, so we already know how they work. Basically, the flow stops until a certain moment in time. And now we're going to see the difference between using a TPT and using this ET here. Okay, so in the first scenario, there's an attorney who doesn't receive an assignment until this event allows him to receive it. Okay, so let's say something happened previously in the process and then it stops here during 24 hours, and once it stops, this attorney is going to be able to perform his activities, perform his task. But now here we have a different scenario. Here The attorney receives the assignment immediately. Okay, there's no time event before it, so they receive it immediately. If they don't complete it on time, it's going to be assigned to a lawyer automatically. Okay, so if the attorney doesn't finish their task on time, this event is going to trigger automatically after 24 hours, and it's going to send the flow to this lawyer. Once the flow is down here, the attorney has lost his task. He can't perform it anymore. Okay, but if the attorney finishes his task on time, so before the 24 hours, then the flow would go out this other way, and there's a legal agency that's going to be managing this process. Okay. Another very important thing to take into account is that several activities could be assigned in one unique form. This also happens in events. We already mentioned it earlier. When we start a process, if whoever initiates a process has to perform 2 or 3 different activities, we only need one start event. Okay, so here we have an example. It says process A. We don't recommend diagramming like this. This is just an example. So it says the administrator selects a document to process, then the administrator has to convert it to PDF, then the administrator has to apply an approval stamp. After that, maybe he has, if it's a complaint, he has to assign it to a complaints manager. If it's a suggestion, he has to evaluate if it's acceptable. If it is acceptable, he has to assign it to a suggestions manager and so on. Okay, so this would be an example of a process. But since in Autoportal the forms are extremely powerful, you don't need to do this. You don't need to set up a whole bunch of objects in a diagram. And besides, we're not going to code absolutely anything. It's not like in other systems where you have to set up a whole bunch of objects and then you have to code each one of them. In Autoportal, all of these activities would be in one unique event. And in this event, we can set up everything in the form to be performed by this person. Okay. Now we're going to see a difference between an intermediate message event and a personal task. So personal tasks are used whenever a process requires human intervention. If you want to allow someone to interact in a process, an event has to be used. Okay? Because it's not the same. To send a task, as we mentioned before, a task is something that appears in our workflow and we must do. It's mandatory, something that we have to do in order for the process to continue. But if we're using an event, we're just saying, okay, the process is going to stop here. And if someone decides to input information, then the process can continue. Okay, so events allow data to be entered into the system, but they are not displayed in the user's workflow. Let's suppose that Sarah is a salesperson and sends an average of 20 offers per day, and that these offers are valid during a month. Okay, after sending the offer, customers can call by phone or send an email telling Sarah that they want to accept the offer. So they'll say, look, remember the offer with a reference 123 that you sent me? I want to accept that offer. Okay, but normally only 5% of the offers are accepted. So why would we have someone with hundreds of tasks in their workflow during all the month, taking into account that they're not really going to have to perform or they're not going to have to interact with any of them, maybe 5% of them. Okay, so if we used a personal task, Sarah would have hundreds of tasks in her workflow, 20 per 1 month. That would be about 600 tasks. Okay, because we said they were 20 per day. So let's say uh, she'd receive an average of 600 tasks in her workflow. Okay, that she doesn't need to manage because we're saying that only 5% of them are actually answered. So instead of that, what we can do is set up an intermediate message event in the process. And every time it's enabled, let's say every time there's an offer, this message event is enabled. But it doesn't mean that Sarah has a task in her workflow. It just means that it's a place where we've enabled access to that process where we can input data and we can unblock the flow. Okay, so let's say when Sarah receives a call or an email, she would be able to access all the offers that are in this situation. Okay, so she is going to be able to access the 600 offers that are in the system, and she's going to be able to unblock whichever of these offers she wants to unblock. Okay,